In Geneva, a city long associated with neutrality and diplomacy, representatives from Ukraine and Russia sit across the table once again. The setting is familiar, the stakes are not. After years of full-scale war, shifting front lines, sanctions, energy shocks, and global diplomatic maneuvering, the question returns with renewed urgency. Can negotiations in Geneva produce a meaningful path toward ending the conflict between Ukraine and Russia? This is not the first time talks have been attempted. Previous negotiation tracks have stalled, collapsed, or been overtaken by battlefield developments. Yet today the geopolitical environment looks different. Military attrition has altered calculations, Western political cycles are evolving, economic pressures weigh heavily on both sides, and much of the world is watching closely, not only for signs of peace but for signals about the future of global order. Can diplomacy succeed where force has failed to deliver decisive outcomes? What would a sustainable settlement even look like after years of territorial disputes, security grievances, and hardened public positions? And perhaps most importantly, are the political incentives aligned strongly enough on either side to make compromise possible? In this documentary analysis, we examine the Geneva peace talks in depth. We will explore the historical context, the military realities shaping negotiation positions, the political and economic pressures influencing both Kyiv and Moscow, and the broader international response. We will assess what is at stake not only for Ukraine and Russia, but for Europe, NATO, emerging powers, and the future of international security architecture. Geneva may be geographically distant from the front lines, but the decisions made here could shape the strategic landscape for decades. Let us begin with the full context of how we arrived at this moment. The Geneva peace talks bring together delegations from Ukraine and Russia under Swiss facilitation, with indirect involvement from key international stakeholders. The talks come after years of intense fighting following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, an escalation of a conflict that began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and armed confrontation in eastern Ukraine. Geneva has historically served as a venue for sensitive negotiations, from Cold War arms control agreements to humanitarian conventions. Its selection reflects an attempt to create a neutral diplomatic space away from immediate political pressures. The timing of the talks follows a prolonged period of battlefield stalemate, high casualties, economic strain, and shifting political winds in multiple capitals. To understand the current negotiations, it is essential to revisit the origins of the war. In 2014, following political upheaval in Kyiv and Ukraine's shift toward closer integration with the European Union, Russia annexed Crimea and supported separatist movements in Donetsk and Luhansk. The Minsk agreements, negotiated in 2014 and 2015, aimed to halt hostilities and establish a framework for autonomy in eastern Ukraine. However, implementation proved inconsistent, and mistrust deepened. In February 2022, Russia launched a large-scale invasion of Ukraine, framing it as a security operation. Ukraine, supported by Western military and financial assistance, mounted a sustained defense. The conflict quickly expanded into Europe's largest war in decades. Sanctions against Russia intensified. NATO reinforced its eastern flank. Energy markets experienced severe volatility. Over time, both sides achieved limited territorial gains but failed to secure decisive breakthroughs. Ukraine conducted counteroffensives to reclaim territory, while Russia consolidated positions in parts of the east and south. The war evolved into a combination of high-intensity artillery exchanges, drone warfare, and fortified defensive lines. International mediation efforts surfaced intermittently. Turkey hosted talks in early 2022. Various back-channel communications were reported. However, trust remained low, and preconditions for negotiations often prevented substantive dialogue. Now, years into the conflict, the Geneva talks emerge amid signs of strategic fatigue and recalibration. Both sides publicly maintain firm positions on territorial integrity and security guarantees, yet the willingness to sit at the same negotiating table suggests recognition that military outcomes alone may not resolve the broader conflict. With this context established, we turn to a detailed breakdown of the core elements shaping the Geneva negotiations. The military situation directly influences the diplomatic calculus. After years of combat, the front lines have stabilized in several sectors. Defensive fortifications, minefields, and entrenched artillery positions have made large-scale breakthroughs increasingly difficult. The war has become one of attrition, relying heavily on artillery, drones, missile systems, and sustained logistical supply. Ukraine's strategic objective remains the restoration of its internationally recognized borders. Its leadership continues to emphasize sovereignty and territorial integrity as non-negotiable principles. Western military assistance has enabled Ukraine to maintain defensive capabilities and conduct selective offensive operations. However, sustaining momentum requires continuous logistical and financial support. Russia's strategic objectives include consolidating territorial control in occupied regions, securing a land corridor to Crimea, and limiting Ukraine's integration into Western military structures. Russian forces have focused on reinforcing defensive lines while maintaining pressure through long-range strikes and drone operations. Both militaries have adapted technologically. Drone warfare has expanded dramatically, altering reconnaissance and strike capabilities. Missile defense systems have been deployed in key urban centers. Tactical innovation has become central to battlefield sustainability. Official defense statements from both Kyiv and Moscow reflect continued confidence in their respective positions. Yet neither side has achieved decisive strategic dominance. This relative equilibrium increases the relevance of negotiations, as military escalation alone appears unlikely to produce a swift resolution. Politically, both governments face complex domestic dynamics. In Kyiv, the leadership must balance the pursuit of peace with public expectations of territorial restoration. Any compromise perceived as legitimizing territorial loss would encounter significant domestic scrutiny. In Moscow, the leadership frames the conflict as tied to national security interests and strategic positioning against NATO expansion. Domestic narratives emphasize resilience against sanctions and Western pressure. Internationally, responses to the Geneva talks vary. European Union officials have expressed cautious optimism, emphasizing support for Ukraine's sovereignty while encouraging diplomatic efforts. NATO leadership reiterates that any settlement must respect international law. The United Nations has signaled support for dialogue consistent with its broader calls for ceasefire and humanitarian access. The United States remains a key external actor, providing military and financial assistance to Ukraine while maintaining diplomatic channels with European partners. At the same time, non-Western powers, including countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, have called for negotiated solutions and expressed concern about prolonged global instability. The economic dimension of the war has been significant. Sanctions imposed on Russia have targeted financial institutions, technology transfers, energy exports, and individuals. Russia has adjusted by reorienting trade flows toward alternative markets, particularly in Asia. Energy exports remain a central component of its economy, though pricing structures and buyers have shifted. Ukraine's economy has been deeply affected by infrastructure damage, reduced industrial output, and displacement of population. International financial assistance has played a critical role in stabilizing government functions. Global markets have experienced volatility linked to energy supply concerns, grain exports, and shipping routes. The Black Sea region is vital for agricultural exports, and disruptions have had ripple effects in food importing countries. The Geneva talks introduce potential economic implications. A credible ceasefire or de-escalation could stabilize energy markets and reduce geopolitical risk premiums. Conversely, failure of negotiations may trigger renewed uncertainty. Regionally, European states remain directly impacted by the conflict's security and economic consequences. NATO has strengthened deployments along its eastern border. Defense spending across Europe has increased significantly in response to perceived security threats. Neighboring countries, including Poland and the Baltic states, emphasize vigilance and sustained support for Ukraine. Turkey continues to balance diplomatic engagement with both Kyiv and Moscow. Switzerland's facilitation role reflects its long-standing neutral diplomatic tradition. Globally, the conflict has influenced perceptions of international norms, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The United Nations has repeatedly addressed the war in General Assembly resolutions. Emerging powers observe closely, evaluating how great power competition unfolds and how sanctions mechanisms operate. Having examined the military, political, economic, and international dimensions, we now turn to the broader question: why do the Geneva talks matter strategically? The Geneva peace talks are not merely about ending active hostilities. They represent a potential inflection point in the evolution of European security architecture. First, the conflict has reshaped NATO's posture. Finland has joined the alliance, and Sweden's accession process has marked a significant shift in Northern European security dynamics. A negotiated settlement could influence how NATO defines its forward presence and long-term strategy. Second, the war has altered the European Union's defense and energy policies. Efforts to diversify energy supplies, reduce dependency on Russian hydrocarbons, and accelerate renewable investments are direct consequences of the conflict. Third, the outcome of negotiations will signal how territorial disputes are addressed in the 21st century. A settlement perceived as rewarding forceful territorial change could have implications beyond Europe. Conversely, a settlement grounded in internationally recognized norms may reinforce existing frameworks. Finally, the talks matter for global power balance. The conflict has deepened Russia's economic ties with non-Western partners and intensified competition between major powers. Whether the Geneva talks produce de-escalation or stalemate will shape broader geopolitical alignments. With this strategic context in mind, we now consider possible future scenarios. For de-escalation to occur, several conditions would need to align. First, both sides would require political space to justify compromise domestically. This could involve phased ceasefires, monitored demilitarized zones, and structured negotiations over disputed territories. Security guarantees would likely be central. Ukraine may seek binding commitments regarding sovereignty and reconstruction support. Russia may prioritize assurances regarding military deployments near its borders. International monitoring mechanisms could be established under multilateral frameworks. Sanctions relief might be phased and conditional upon compliance with agreed terms. However, barriers to peace remain significant. Mutual distrust is deeply entrenched. Verification mechanisms would need to be robust. Domestic political opposition on either side could constrain negotiators. A realistic assessment suggests that even in a de-escalation scenario, implementation would be gradual and fragile. Confidence-building measures would likely precede any comprehensive settlement. Escalation remains possible if negotiations collapse or if battlefield dynamics shift abruptly. Renewed offensives, expanded missile campaigns, or involvement of additional actors could intensify the conflict. Triggers might include disputed ceasefire violations, breakdown of monitoring frameworks, or political changes in key capitals. Expanded sanctions or counter-sanctions could deepen economic fragmentation. Regional expansion risks would depend on alliance dynamics. While direct confrontation between NATO and Russia remains widely viewed as undesirable, miscalculation cannot be entirely ruled out. The economic consequences of escalation would likely include renewed energy volatility, disrupted trade routes, and increased defense expenditures globally. Strategically, escalation could solidify blocs and accelerate long-term decoupling between Western and Russian economic systems. The long-term impact of the Geneva talks extends beyond the immediate conflict. Alliances may evolve based on perceptions of reliability and commitment. Defense spending trends in Europe are likely to remain elevated, reflecting structural security reassessment. Energy security policies have already shifted, with diversification efforts reshaping global supply chains. Infrastructure investments in liquefied natural gas, renewables, and interconnectors reflect structural adaptation. Global trade patterns may continue adjusting as sanctions regimes and geopolitical alignments influence supply chains. Emerging powers may leverage the situation to expand diplomatic influence. The war has also revived debates over deterrence, conventional warfare, and hybrid tactics. Military doctrines worldwide are being reassessed in light of lessons from Ukraine. The Geneva peace talks represent a significant diplomatic moment in one of the most consequential conflicts of the 21st century. Years of war have reshaped military doctrines, altered economic networks, and transformed European security structures, yet the fundamental issues at the heart of the conflict remain complex and deeply contested. Diplomacy offers a path toward de-escalation, but it requires political will, compromise, and sustained international engagement. Escalation remains possible if negotiations falter or if battlefield dynamics shift. The decisions made in Geneva will resonate far beyond the negotiating room. They will influence alliance structures, energy markets, defense policies, and global perceptions of stability. As observers and global citizens, we are left with important questions. Can entrenched positions give way to pragmatic compromise? And what kind of security framework will emerge if peace is achieved? We invite you to share your thoughtful analysis in the comments. How should the international community balance principles of sovereignty with the realities of negotiation? And what lessons should policymakers draw from this conflict for future crises? Thank you for watching this in-depth geopolitical analysis.